everyone. Welcome to the Writer's Realm podcast, and thanks for joining us on the epic adventure we call writing. We're your hosts, Bob,
Holly.
Austin,
Austin, sorry.
and with our special guest, Timothy J McBride. How's it going, Timothy?
Hello. I'm doing pretty good. Thank you guys for having me. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Hey,
Yeah.
so it's about the end of November here. We're going to go ahead and talk about our project is, what we've been working on, where we're at with that November project. If you happen to be working on something, so Holly, where are you at on yours?
Yeah, so I'm still working on Heartbound. I'm actually really excited. The last week or so, I've been kind of working on the part of the novel that I knew was going to be a little sticky. So I'm past the exciting introduction. We kind of are starting to get to know who the characters are. And I'm leading up to the point where I'm about to drop a big bomb. So I had to get through that kind of awkward spot where I'm moving the story along, but nothing too exciting is going on at this point. Just laying the groundwork. So I finally managed to get through that. And I'm one chapter away from where I'm dropping this big bomb. So I'm so excited because I've kind of been lagging a little bit with my project, not really having the motivation to like get through these scenes. But now that I am through it, I'm so excited. Like I'm just ready to full throttle because I know the next little bit is going to be really exciting. So that's where I'm at right now. How about you guys?
Right on. Yeah, I realized all of a sudden I was writing a flashback story, so a story within a story. And then I realized like it was growing. The short story was growing, and I'm like, I only wanted this to be like maybe 5,000 words or something, and it turned into like there's just more to tell. So I realized like, wow, I kind of pulled an Austin sort of, and like, well, I have two stories here. So I wrapped that story up. It's a 10,000 word short story, or thereabouts, complete, and it's awesome, and I love it. And then I just realized today that I am pretty much done with my project that I started. Now, I know we had set a goal, like a word count goal, and it was like 50K, but I'm at maybe 40. But like, I was just working on it like all day today, and I'm like, you know what? I can put like maybe 2,500 or 3,000 more words in here somewhere, but I don't know where another eight are gonna go. Like this story's done. Like I'm done. You know what I mean? So as far as like completing my project, I mean I'm done. Maybe like I said, maybe another couple of thousand, which will happen in edits. Could flesh a couple things out. But that's it. I'm done. And I also like. I just have a tangent question. I wonder if the people that started Nano are European, because November is a horrible time to write because we have family. I mean, if you're American, you're going to have like a week's worth, at least a week's worth of family in town, and it's just ridiculous. But anyway, that's my tangent question for the day. Austin.
Yeah, so speaking of family, yeah, that kind of hit a huge wall for me. So I'm trying to get a little caught up on things, but I kind of hit like the big climactic part of one of my two books. And so one of the main characters like is on the verge of death, and like the devil appears to him and is like trying to negotiate selling his soul for like power in order to save the whole group of main characters. And then like you kind of get this like cliffhanger moment of the end of that chapter where it's like you don't know what he decides in the end, and then you like flashback to the main characters and they solve everything before the other guy comes back from the dead, and you're like, oh, okay, I guess he didn't have to sell his soul after all. And then he wakes up, so he sold his soul for nothing, and it's just this horribly beautiful moment of just like wasting the one thing you got.
Wow.
So I didn't expect to write like to have that moment. It was just one of those fun things of like, oh man, wouldn't it be just the worst possible thing I could do to
Yeah.
this character? And I love doing that to my characters.
I was just gonna ask that. I was just gonna ask all of you guys this, Timothy included. Like, am I the only one that like tries to put my characters through the worst stuff possible? No. Okay. I just want to make sure. Like today, yeah, I'm thinking about stuff I could add, and I'm like, wow, what happens if this guy twists his ankle and blah blah blah. I'm like, wow, that'd be. And I was like, geez, what am I doing to these poor people? But it's just
Well,
like we're torturing them or something.
yeah, it's like one of those great things of like solving writer's block. If you ever have writer's block, just think, what is the worst possible thing that could happen at this moment?
Yeah,
And then make it happen.
make it happen. All right.
Yeah, I agree. The one that I'm working on right now, I thought it would be a great idea for the two characters to be introduced when she accidentally shoots him.
That's great.
Why not, right?
Why not? All right, good. All right, so I'm not the only one. Timothy, well, have you been working on anything during November, or what's your latest project you've been working on?
Back in October, because I write a lot of horror stories, I'm like, it's October. I have to write.
You
I
have
have to
to.
write something.
Yes.
So I did that, and in the month of November, I've just kind of been reassessing projects that I've kind of like sat on the back burn, and I'm starting to reevaluate them and get working on continuing those bigger projects that tied to my to the book I already had released. Uh, so that's kind of what's going on for me right now. There's a lot of planning right now, and
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, does this now? I found you on Instagram, and I saw that you were part of an anthology. Is this book that you're talking about with that anthology, or is this something separate?
So the book in and of itself is an anthology. So instead of it being one part of a series of books, the book has contained within it multiple short stories that make up that anthology.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, for some of our readers, or not our readers, I mean, I guess readers, but we're talking about
Hope so.
listeners. Sorry, yeah, listeners slash watchers slash readers. Anthology, like, what is that? Like, pretend I'm an alien. I just showed up. What is an anthology?
Um, okay. So with really any term in art, definitions differ from individual to individual, but I would say an anthology is when you have one piece. It can be a book, a movie, whatever, and within that piece there are smaller, shorter stories that are connected in some way, timeline, character, whatever. An example of this, from modern day that people might know is the movie Trick or Treat, where there's a different, shorter plot lines into one bigger movie.
Okay, okay. And so your books, I'm sorry, you have a story or two in this anthology. And what's the name of the anthology?
The anthology is called Vessels of Core Conquest. Core is spelled C-O-R, and it's the name of one of the characters. Um, and Conquest is in reference to the first of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, because that's symbolism, especially when it comes to the rapture and biblical symbolism is playing an important role in the work for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, that's very cool. And is it I don't know, is it so it sounds like fantasy or horror, or I have no idea what this,
It's
where would I
it
find this, what
is
genre?
you would find this in sci-fi for sure. It has pretty much it checks all the boxes there.
Hmm.
Space exploration, aliens, warfare, all that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay. So what are your, I mean, could you share a little bit of what your short story's about?
Yeah. Are you referring to the one I worked on in October, or like the ones contained in the book?
The one that's contained in the book, the anthology.
Okay, so there are a few in the book,
Hmm.
and the first one is incredibly short. It's called Champion of the Anomaly, and it basically just kind of sets the scene. It's when this alien deity creates the character named Core and basically gives him his mission that sets up the rest of the stories. He says, you're going to be, your soul is going to be connected to the souls of different human heroes throughout the course of the next few hundred years. And you're going to learn from them how to defeat the big bad guy, basically. So the premise of the story is that the universe has, reset countless times by now, and the only constant is this one being called the anomaly. The anomaly being the one that created Core, and so he knows what Core has to do to prevent the calamity from happening at the end of the universe, to give humanity that chance to keep on thriving and to keep on building.
That is amazing. All right. Now let's just pretend you're helping me trying to get into an anthology. Like how
Well,
would
so real
oh,
quick,
oh,
I actually had a question. So, like, I know
oh
there's
yeah,
two
go ahead.
different kinds of anthologies. So there's like the kind where it's like my own work, where it's like all of my short stories are connected together, and then there's the idea of an anthology where it's like, oh, we might all be submitting stories to an anthology about like mechs, and it's like dozens of writers putting their stories together. So this is all your stories put together in your own anthology. Is from the
Correct.
sounds of
Yeah,
it
yeah,
correct? Okay.
yeah.
Oh, so this isn't like okay. Yeah, I thought it was the other one where there's a bunch of people submitting or something, submitting their stories.
I think that's so
Yeah.
amazing. I really struggle with writing short stories,
Mhm.
mostly because I'm never straight to the point about anything. So I think it's fascinating to like that you have the ability to write so many short stories that are that good. Like that to me is I just cannot wrap my mind around that concept.
Yeah, it's funny because I remember when I started this undertaking, I had so many ideas, I was outlining them all, and I had 12 stories. Only one of those would end up in the final product, and I would need to create the other four after the fact. One of them was just a straight up recreation of another idea that I wanted to retool and fix. Another one was original, and then there were two really short ones that I just kind of threw in there for fun. Um, the first of which being the one I just described, which is kind of setting the scene for the rest of them. Uh, yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the really cool things about having like your own self-contained anthology is that like you can just jump around and be like, oh, hey, like this is a little cool idea. Like I don't have to fully flesh it out. I've talked about it before. Like I'm the weird kind of Tolkien nerd where I love the Silmarillion. It's like, oh, I just need a bite here, a bite there. Like I don't need to watch them or read about them walking through the fields for 300 pages. Please just give me a two-page story that says, here's the whole Lord of the Rings contained in 2 pages. Don't worry about it. It's not a big deal.
Mhm.
Nice.
Yeah. For me, it's I definitely, and this is one of the the problems I have with writing, as I'm sure many people have as well, is we have so many different kinds of tones and scenes in the story, and you want to get to the really exciting parts, but we have to get through the setup and and building up that tension properly.
Hmm.
And that's just kind of part of the deal. If you had only flashy scenes, right, like
Mhm.
it would be hard to string that along in a way that's neat and clean for sure.
Hmm.
Yeah, so, like, with that in mind, like, what would you say is, like, the big I mean, obviously the length, but what's the biggest difference when you're looking at building a short story versus a full-length novel in your ideas?
I mean, honestly, besides length, it's difficult to nail down you know, what constitutes as a short story versus a full versus a full length novel or novella. Um, Personally, from what I've noticed from from works that I read, is that shorter stories, they don't always focus so much on characterization, especially for horror. And
Mm,
I definitely deviated from that a bit in my anthology because I knew that they were all going to be strung together, so I could kind of have that room to make those larger story arcs. But usually in shorter stories, you don't have these grand personal journeys where the protagonist has this revelation at the end, because it's such a short time that it's
mhm.
not realistic for that to happen. It can
Yeah.
be done, don't get me wrong, um, but it's just more situational, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, and especially with a horror short story, there's a decent chance that they're dead at the end. So, but it reminds me, like you talking about that. I talked about it in October when we were going through, and the Magnus Archives is a good example of a podcast that did that, where it's like you have your like person who the story is about that week, but then it's like you have these like people that are going through and doing the filing and the archiving of all of these like different reports, and so you get this like ongoing thing with them for 200 weeks. Whereas like the
Mhm.
person that's giving the testimony is only there for a week and is, either narrowly escaped or is dead, and they, got the report afterwards. So it's that same kind of a thing of like, you don't necessarily need the same kind of characterization of that
Yeah.
one character. And if you do get that, it's a lot more like, oh, they've got like a fun quirkiness to them that lets you latch onto them, and then, not be totally devastated throughout the whole thing. So
Yeah. Like I've definitely played with that idea myself of like, I've had ideas for like stories that take place in like, in like forlorn villages. And it's from different people's perspective. Maybe it's the same person a couple times or whatever, but it's all these different accounts from different people that kind of lead up to some big event affecting all of them at the end or something. It's something that definitely reminds some people of Bram Stoker's Dracula, where it's a bunch of like shorter accounts that all have ties to this this strange individual. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's true. So short story is generally under 10,000 words,
Mhm.
generally. So that means, like you said, less, like hardly any character arc, I guess,
Mhm.
right?
Again,
mhm.
yeah, it does depend. Like I always do strive to make my characters go on some kind of journey. It depends on the genre, of course. Like usually if it's horror, it's not a fun journey. But
Yeah.
if it's like like a shorter sci-fi story, then yeah, usually there will be some kind of like um, optimistic, um, message about like courage or or innovation or whatever.
So there's
Um,
a theme then. So
yes,
we have a
absolutely.
working theme. Yeah.
For
Yeah,
sure.
and
I would say any story, personally, in my opinion, needs some kind of theme. That's what gives it, substance and meaning. Uh,
Nice. Yeah. That's good.
yeah, and thinking about like the structure side of things, because like I almost, I was gonna say I almost only write novels, but I only write novels and then really, really long novels. So like for me, it's like it's not just okay. My main character has like the story structure that's going behind their arc, but it's like they'll have an A, a B, probably a C arc going on, and then so will all of the other side characters and even minor characters will have like some sort of that. But like I think with a short story for me, it's like, okay, I have a 7 point story structure and I'm going to run that main character through it. And nobody else gets any development because, it's horror. They all have to die. Or, if it's sci fi, it's like, okay, they're all like, working there. They're not doing the main action. And so, like, that's kind of where I have seen, as I've started trying to be more, have a
Mhm.
more economy of my words, which my first book was 135,000 words. So,
mhm.
not so good on the whole being brief. But yeah, like just really realizing that there's that difference of like, I don't need to see what, that random red shirt over there is up
Mhm.
to in his life. I
Yeah.
don't need to know his backstory. I don't need to know where he's going to be in 30 years or what his kids' names are. Like,
Mhm.
I think that's
Yeah.
part of it too, is like really honing in your focus.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I feel like that's why they suggest to a lot of new writers to really spend a lot of time writing short stories, because you learn your writing habits a lot quicker, and because
Mhm.
you learn how to describe things that are important to your story, right? Because you can always fill in things later, but having the
Mhm.
ability to actually describe something in a short amount of words is really hard.
Yeah.
So I feel like, again, for someone who's able to do that, I think that's absolutely fascinating to me. I completely skipped that part when I started writing. I was like, I can't do this. This is awful. And I just started writing a trilogy. So for me, it was out the window. But yeah, it's so hard to be able to, and it's so important to be able to condense everything down like that.
Mhm.
Yeah. Like one of the stories in my book, it is definitely upwards of 10,000 words. I would say it's more of a novella. It was always the longest one. It was the first one I wrote that ended up being in the product. And I'm like, it's definitely characterized by things we described because it had a larger cast. So I had to develop them, and that takes more time. You know, the short horror stories that you'll see on my website, there's like one character and an antagonist. One protagonist, one antagonist. That's usually it. Um,
Mhm.
it's a
Hey,
lot more personal. It's a direct conflict between the protagonist and the monster that's haunting them, stalking them, messing with them.
I know I'm putting a pause on this real quick, but I forgot to ask, how can readers find your work?
Right. So, I mean, my book is currently available exclusively on barnesandnoble.com. I'm working on getting it available elsewhere, but right now that's where it's at. If you know, otherwise they can find my social media, author McBride, author_McBride. And then there is a website that is dedicated solely to this project, the Vessels of Core, which is just called vesselsofcore.webador.com. Webador is like the website builder that I had to use to get it out. So that's where I post all my short stories that are completely for free. You know, the website is there for people to explore. I don't, like the short stories are there to be enjoyed. I'm not gonna that behind a paywall.
Well, you got to pay the bills, though.
That's why I have it. That's why I work.
Yeah.
30 hours a week.
Yeah,
Don't
no,
we
I get it.
all?
That's why I got 2 jobs.
I read somewhere about actors and how whenever you meet someone that's an actor, the next question is, "Oh, so what restaurant do you work in?" Like, because like we can't pay for our own stuff. Any kind of art is going to be hard, to
Yeah,
live
I've
on.
started thinking of it as I'm an author who daylights as an analyst.
Yeah,
So instead of I moonlight as an author, I'm
Right.
daylighting as an analyst.
yeah.
That's awesome. So going back to your anthology, how long, 'cause it sounds like there's a lot of moving parts, how long from start to finish roughly did it take you to get through the whole process?
Because there was a lot of trial and error. There was a lot of um, revisions involved, editing involved, and I had to do all that myself. I was starting from nothing, so I couldn't afford an editor. Growing up, I was always naturally gifted with an eye for grammatical accuracy, so I could, in a way, be my own editor. That does not mean that there were no mistakes. I read it now and I'm like, crap, I missed one. But you know, I had to be the one to polish it up because I didn't have any other options. Um, but from start to finish, from like the second where I started to think about it and start outlining it in my notebook to when it was finally released, we're looking at uh, I think just under 2 years for me for that one.
How many words? Can I ask how many like words total would the whole thing be?
I want to say it's not too much. I think it's in like the 70,000s. I remember I had to cut something at the end, so I think it is down to like 74,000 something. I want to say it's around there.
That's a good size.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thing.
That's neat. So, like, are you? I mean, short story. You just love short stories. Did you fall? I don't know. Did you fall in love with short stories, or how did you focus? How are you kind of laser focused on right now, just creating short stories and putting them into an anthology?
It's interesting. Like it started off with me loving short stories because I love like the whole creepy pasta trend that was going around back in the day. People loved short stories you can find on the internet.
Yeah.
That short horror stories. And also I had all these crazy ideas and I'm like, I want to get them all out, but I don't have the time to make them all these full-length novels. And also frankly, I don't have the energy to, draw this out for so long. I constantly need something new. That's always been like one of my big obstacles. Like I constantly need to remind myself, stay focused. You're not done with this one yet. You know, um, another thing is definitely, inspired by outside sources. My favorite author is H.P. Lovecraft. He was famous for his short stories. And the more I learn about him and his life, it's crazy. I guess I'm like, oh yeah, that definitely had an influence in this theme or whatever. It's like,
Hmm.
100%. There was a variety of factors that led to my love of short stories.
Right.
From admiration of authors like Poe and Lovecraft to just the fact that it was what I found to be most efficient for myself.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great point.
So
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was about to go completely off topic, so please
Oh,
go ahead
perfect.
I'm
first.
sure we all were.
No, I was gonna say that's a great point with your inspiration with Lovecraft, because all of those authors, Edgar Rice Burroughs and yeah, Poe, they were all in magazines, you know, they're just
Hmm.
kind of piecemealed into men's magazines back in the day, and
Hmm.
they didn't have. I mean, they're the perfect length, I think, right? Yeah, I
Yeah.
just never thought about it like that. That's
Hmm.
great.
Yeah,
Um,
and
s- so I
Ollie wants to take us somewhere
I do,
else.
I do.
go.
So I don't know. I'm kind of just piecing this together in my brain now. I don't know why I didn't think of this at the time. But I don't know if anyone has seen the show, but it's the Fall of the House of Usher. And
Mm,
it just
Hmm.
recently came out on Netflix. And
I
I
haven't seen
think
it
that
yet.
is considered like an anthology, right? Because it's a series of each episode is kind of what a different story,
Mm,
Hmm.
a different one of Edgar Allan Poe's stories, but the whole thing kind of blends into one whole plot line.
mm,
So
Hmm.
I think that would be considered,
mhm,
it's a show,
Hmm.
but it would be an anthology, I guess, if it was written.
mm.
Yeah, something like
Yeah,
that,
like
or also like what was it, Black Mirror, where it's like they're
Yeah,
all loosely connected by like this horror theme centered
right.
around technology, but then it's
mm,
like okay, they're all these different stories, and I think they even had like different crews and stuff working on some of it. So I don't know how deep that
mm.
goes, but yeah,
Mm,
it's just interesting to do it in television as well.
mm. Yeah, those are all good
Fascinating.
examples. Yeah. Wow. So horror. So no. You gonna stick with this is your favorite topic, I guess, right, Timothy? Instead of science fiction or YA fantasy or something like that, or epic fantasy, you definitely prefer horror stories.
I mean, yeah, I mean, for me, really all kinds of speculative fiction are something that I take an interest in. Like I do write fantasy on occasion. I don't have any completed projects right now that would be considered fantasy. Some that are dark fantasy that are a mixture of horror and fantasy. Vessels of Core has a few horror elements sprinkled in there from
Mhm.
time to time, but it's definitely, it's definitely more like, it's like science fiction, adventure, or something like that.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, but horror
Yeah.
also plays a big role in my life. My short stories, I draw a lot from, personal experiences, where science
Mm.
fiction, well, I don't live in a spacefaring future, so I can't really draw from personal experience there, but I do draw from like actual scientific principles, like how they
Mhm.
communicate given the speed of light and the distances that they're separated apart from each other.
Mm,
Yeah, and I think
That
too,
definitely
like
plays a
as you get into more and more things, like whenever I'm writing, a novel, like it's hard to get through a whole novel, no matter what genre it is, without putting elements of horror in it, or elements of fantasy. Like
Mhm.
there's that escapism that's going to come in no matter what it is, or the loosey goosey feeling of the world. Like even if I'm writing a hard sci-fi, there's going to be some of it that, like through the lens of the like point of view character, is going to
Mhm.
feel like fantasy because they don't know how
Yeah.
warp drives work. Like they don't get it.
mm,
It's all magic to them. Like,
Yeah.
and you know what? The science fiction horror that I'm writing right now is actually like literally using the um piece of magic in order to make their speed of light travel work. And like it becomes
Mm.
this whole plot point. And so like there's this idea of like this genre is here and this genre is here and they're completely separate, but there's just it's this amorphous blob that we're bisecting and taking a piece out of and trying to mush it into a box just for advertisement purposes.
Mhm.
mm. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Timothy, I have to ask, since we talked about this back in October, what do you consider to be horror? Like, is it just the
Mm.
overall theme? Is it like a character? Is it just like specific monsters that are in the story? Like, what do you make something like? What would you consider horror?
That's an interesting question, and it's so subjective. Like to me, a lot of my horror is very much inspired by the works of Lovecraft in the sense that it is cosmic, it is psychological, but different people find so many different things terrifying. I also write a bit of body horror. That is definitely something that speaks to me. Um, Given my history with eating disorders. So for me, body image and, the inevitability of change is something that scares me. So, but different people have so many different fears that, someone,
Mhm.
could easily read, different parts of Lord of the Rings, like the Barrow White scenes and all that, and that is horror to them. There's just, yeah, I don't know. It's such a difficult question, and I don't have the, like, frankly, just like the wisdom or the experience to know what constitutes objectively speaking as horror, because it can be so many different things.
I think that was pretty much the general consensus for all of us as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, but like you said, like it's so moving when you draw on your own personal experiences. Because I also have body dysmorphia and have suffered with like eating disorders through most of my life, and it's a constant battle. And like whether you're talking about that exact thing or you're using it and like just taking that emotion that's charged with this thing and applying it to something else, like
Hmm.
the being vulnerable is what really comes through. And I think especially in short stories, like those are the moments. If you can hit the reader with that in the first paragraph, then they're like in love with your character and they're along for the ride and they're hooked. And you don't have to string them along for too long because it's a short story. And so like
Yeah.
it's just such a beautiful way to like a shortcut into people caring about your characters is just be vulnerable. So like I actually keep a journal of like a lot of how I'm feeling and those kind of things, because then I can just like pull out a couple of sentences, throw it into like the internal dialogue of my character, and suddenly everybody's like, "Oh yeah, this is relatable because it's real."
Hmm. Yeah. And for me, that's a huge part of it as well. Like when you have something that is personally charged, it's easy for you to make, the story incredibly dark. And my short stories, such as the ones on my website, like they are known to be brutal to the characters. I remember earlier, Bob said like, "Oh yeah, let's give my character like a sprained ankle." My characters wish they had a sprained ankle. But like 100%, when it's so charged to that, it's easy for it to be, you know, dark. And when it's a short story, you don't have to string them along and trudge them through that suffering for so long. But
Mhm.
for me, I do, and I think it's necessary. I need to have just a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel so that people are still interested. They think it can get better. They want to see the characters succeed. Sometimes there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Other times it's just an eye of some miscreant monster that uh,
It's just an
That's funny.
anglerfish waiting for you.
Yeah. Oh gosh. That's funny. So getting
So
back, oh,
no, you go first.
we love talking over on the show. We should have
We're all
like
just
one of
so
those.
excited.
Yeah, we should have one of those sticks, those talking sticks. But
I got the conch.
yeah, gosh, yeah. So a short story. I mean, we need to have. I think somebody here just said it. Like we need to have a character, us, and I think like we really grab hold of, and like we really want to follow and root for, right? So I mean that's essential. So there's still like essential stuff within a short story, but it's just
Mhm,
all like concentrated, I guess.
for
Mhm.
sure. Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, I would say so. Like, like rules in any form of art is a touchy subject, but I would say that literature definitely does have, certain set of conventions or just, expectations. I mean, technically you can write whatever you want, but, there are certain things that people, that critics, readers, whatever, would agree make a story interesting and captivating, and instead of just, poorly paced or
Mhm.
just, not very well developed. And it's an interesting topic about, can the protagonist, be someone that we wouldn't usually root for? For example, you know, I love all types of gothic horror. So of course Frankenstein is one of my favorite books. Uh, Not very original for someone's favorite, but it's mine. And and yeah, like Dr. Frankenstein, Victor, he's an interesting character because like he does a lot of questionable things, but we still want, at least I felt this way, I still wanted to see him get through it. We still wanted to see him overcome this monster, this situation that he's created for himself and for his loved ones. Uh, and yeah, and so I think that in a way, when you have a flawed protagonist, it can almost speak to us on a different level. Like we see the flaws in that person and we kind of see a little bit of ourselves in them. Like I love Lord of the Rings, right? And people kind of like to joke about me because like, oh, I like the orcs. And that's true, I do like the orcs. But um
Well, the
it's
orcs are
because
complicated people.
they're misunderstood.
They're POWs. It's like really intense. So, like, if
They
you don't know
are.
the history of orcs, it's intense.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, absolutely. But like I was reading this article in a magazine and it was talking about how like the orcs were Tolkien's representation of the perversion of nature. And that kind of ties into like their industriousness, how they tear down, forests around Isengard and use it to fuel their war machine. And I can definitely see that as an aspect of humanity. Remember, this was, after World War One that Tolkien wrote this. He saw an industrialized war in his lifetime, right there in front of him. It was unlike anything people had ever seen before. And, you know, in that way, you can look at it at so many different levels. And like the artillery destroyed entire environments. Um, the gas used on by both sides, would kill plant life and anything in its path. And in that sense, the orcs remind us of ourselves in the sense that even though we have the capability to be these amazing, you know, positive individuals, we also do have a smaller, weaker, uglier side of ourselves that needs to be suppressed. Otherwise, it will continue to multiply into a force to be reckoned with, right?
Wow.
That's kind of how I view, the archetype of the goblin or the orc.
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that.
Nice. Wow. Well said. Holly.
Yes, I have a question. Put up my hand. Yeah, so if someone was interested in writing an anthology, is there a process? So what I mean by this is you specifically, when you come up with an idea, obviously you have to have different ideas for each of these short stories. Do you generally have the ideas for the short stories first and then just see how they connect? Or do you have an overall plot that is going to be like the whole anthology and then work each of those short stories out afterwards?
So it's an interesting question because the first book, I plan on making this a series, and I work on the sequel from time to time. But it was an interesting experience for me because it started off looking completely different. It was originally going to be a collection of 12 different stories that were some sci-fi and some horror. I decided that it didn't always work because the horror was always in the present day, and it just seemed kind of tone clashing. So I needed to make it, and I wanted to make it just sci-fi. So I'm like, okay, we're gonna make it just sci-fi, and I had to kind of string it all together now. And I'm like, okay, so I had all the ideas when I first started off. To answer your question, I kind of skipped over that. I had the ideas for every story, outlined every single one of them in, frankly, excessive detail because I knew it would be a long time before I went back to that outline. I just had to outline every single one and then write every single one. So, I might write an outline for something, but not get to it until like a year later. Um, so for me, I came up with the concept, but then the concept evolved over time. Like the very main character of Core wasn't even created when I first came up with the story. He's a crucial part of the whole thing, but because he's absent for so much of the story, I got to keep the stories the way they were because he's, connected with the soul of the human. So when he wakes up in the year 3025, he has their memories, but he himself was not actually there. So I could keep those stories while retaining their themes and how those themes affected him um, in his awakening. I hope that answers your question. I know it was long.
Yeah, no, that absolutely does. That's so fascinating. Like just to be able to think about writing something and just putting it off to the side. So obviously you are a planner then and not a pantser.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I have tried both. I'm still very much at the beginning of my writing journey. And, but ever since I started to get serious when I was around 13, I was always a planner. And and the outlines got more and more detailed as I continued. It started off like just one page of this happens, arrow, this happens, arrow, this happens. And, it was like one sentence of like to summarize a whole big event. Eventually I got to writing down like quotes that I find that, that I wanted to use, or I would write down like specific plot points for every chapter. I think it's a bit of an overkill though. But I had to do it because like I said earlier, it might be a year until I get back to it. I needed to remember all that. I needed that stuff to jog my memory.
Mhm.
Um, my outlining has definitely evolved. Like for the sequel, Vessels, which I'm going to call Vessels of Core War,
Mhm.
um, I outline it a little bit differently. I outline it based on the character arc instead of purely the plot.
Mhm.
So the plot is referenced several times because this happens and this affects them XYZ. Um, but um, I wanted it to be, I wanted to focus more on the characters because the problem I find, at least with with planning and meticulously organizing the plot, is sometimes you find yourself writing something that isn't what that character would do, and you
Mhm.
have to find a way to make that believable. You can't always do these things for plot convenience, even if you need it. Even if you need that piece right there at that moment to make everything else happen, you know, you do want it to go naturally. And I have tried to write stories that are just in the pantsing fashion where I just go for it. And I made a mistake because I was trying to write a mystery, and I'm like, wait, I need to plan this first.
Mm.
Yeah. I feel like mystery is the one thing that I've run into where I'm like, I love pantsing everything, but like a mystery, it's just like, what do I do? So I realized though, I can pants it if like, have you ever seen the movie Memento? It's like it starts on the wrong end and then moves backwards. Like if I
Mhm.
write the mystery that way, I can pants it and like, okay, here's where they solve it, and
Yeah.
then work my way backwards
Right.
as I go.
Yep.
Um, but yeah, no, and actually thinking about that, like I think the thing that I've done that's most like short story writing is actually like the intro chapter to a mystery novel where it's like you get introduced to a character, they go through a little arc, you see them, and then they die. And like that's your dead body at the beginning of the story. And it's like
Mhm.
I I don't want just some random kid in his bed getting murdered like Nightmare on Elm Street. Like I want to actually be attached to it. I want to care that Johnny Depp died in that scene, even though I
Mhm.
don't. And so just like trying to figure out those ways that you can, really suck people in super quickly. And so like something for me, like I think trying to figure out a way to make your narration or something like that, any piece of it unique, whether it's your setting or your character, like we talked about. But like there's a thing to be said about having a bland character where the anybody can feel like they're in that position. But
Mhm.
like talking about like having a character that's super like a gourmand, and like everything he's talking about, it's like, oh, this smells of such and such, and like, oh, I
Yeah.
bet this tastes like this, and like focusing on these things, it's like makes you think about a world that you wouldn't normally see in that way, and makes you
Mhm.
appreciate them, and then whatever you're going to do with it, whether you're going to kill them or they're going to go off on some adventure, like they're going to go throw the ring into Mordor, like whatever,
Mhm.
Mount Doom, I guess, if we're going to
Mhm.
being correct.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
It's not
Well,
wrong. It's not as precise. That's all.
Yeah. It's not technically correct, which is the worst. So technically correct is the best kind of correct.
Absolutely.
well, I think it's great talking to you because I did have an anthology idea. As writers, we all have what 500 more ideas sitting on the back burner somewhere. Um, and I was thinking about a horror anthology, um, starting with like a haunted hotel and
Mm.
and then have different authors come in and write about something about the hotel. But I didn't think about having like an underlying theme throughout. Not horror, but like there's something else going on. It's haunted,
Yeah.
but why is it haunted? Right? I
Mhm.
would never have thought about that. It would have been just all right, spooky, big spooky building, go, without actually putting some thought behind it and some planning and making it really cohesive, right? Or trying to get all the stories to be as cohesive as could be. with something bigger, So that was brilliant. Thank you very much for just sharing your experience and all that. Yeah, that's awesome. Anybody else have any other questions?
I was actually just going to say something you said earlier. I thought was really interesting. You had said there was a bit of a clash between doing like oh my gosh, part of it sci-fi and part of it horror. Because
Mhm.
I was curious if there would be a way to write like, it's like, it'd be really cool if you had an entire anthology and then each short story was like a different genre. But
Mhm.
that kind
Mm,
of answers that.
Mm.
I didn't really think about what you said, how it kind of just clashes with each other. Like it's hard to keep like a consistent theme
yeah.
throughout something if you're jumping back and forth between genre.
I will say that just made me think it would be really cool to go through and daisy chain them. So it's like, okay, this one is sci-fi and horror. The next one's horror and fantasy. One after
Mhm.
that's fantasy and romance. And like just
Mhm.
kind of daisy chaining like a big loop to get you
Mhm.
back to the initial one. And
Mhm.
just having those kind of core elements that are the same and whatever you want to bring in that'll tie it together. Like it could be like generations of a family, like each one's going through these different things or something like that.
Mm.
Like, thank you. That sounds
Write
great.
it down.
Or just like what Timothy's talking about, like I think Timothy, you mentioned it was like some horror sprinkled in the horror elements,
Hmm.
right? So it's not straight horror, right? It's more
Mhm.
like a kind of a science fiction,
Yeah, like
story.
yeah, the villain is basically its name is Legion, and it is the living universe. It is the absence of matter. It's the space in between the dust and the planets that make up, the various um bodies of the cosmos. And um, the rank and file grunts of this villain are creatures called thralls, and thralls are basically aliens, humans, whatever that have been mutated and perverted by by Legion's influence, and they have been twisted into these monstrosities. And so they definitely do bring a sense of horror to the story. Like when they first make their appearance in the anthology, they are compared to demons in the sense that when they land and their ship opens up, there happens to be a fire going on in front of the ship. So I use that to kind of, say that they were wreathed in flame, like, like the denizens of hell.
Mm.
And that kind of ties to their nature and to to what they are. But, they in a way are tragic. And I allude to this is that their eyes remain, uh, you know, filled with tears because the host of the thrall is very much aware of what they're doing, but they have no control over their body,
Mm.
um, because
That was
their
amazing.
body is just a puppet of Legion, which is this immense hive mind.
Wow.
Uh, yeah.
Well, I wanted to sleep tonight, but I guess not. Thank you, Timothy. That was brilliant, though. I mean, I'm totally gonna go look for your book.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm also
So
a sucker for hive minds. It's such a fun thing.
mm,
One of the things I've got on the back burner has a main character that's a part of a hive mind and just kind of like feeling out like they're a part of this whole, but they're not the whole, and like kind of dealing with that whole thing of like a cog in the machine. What does it feel like, kind of a thing. So
Yeah,
just a
for
sucker for it.
me, the best way that I could possibly imagine a hive mind is, because there is a hive mind civilization in the story that is natural. It's not controlled by one entity. It is a civilization of natural hive minds. They are extinct in the story, but their existence has been alluded to, and how it works. I had to think about some things like how does their political system work? How does their rank structure work in the military? It would be like if you were one person, but there were like a million of you. You can be
Mhm.
in a million places at once. That's kind of how I would imagine a hive mind, where it's just a bunch
mm,
of yous and you all have the same mind. You just are in different
Mhm.
places at once.
Yeah, I was doing some research on neurons and how those work and operate.
Mhm.
And so it's the idea that like your thoughts are actually just like as they're firing off, it's kind of like the way a beehive works. Like they are all kind of combating with each other until there's kind of this one consensus that overtakes the other. It's actually kind of a violent process, and like they're doing the dance, but like a lot of times they're actually hitting each other to stop them from doing one thing, and like actually all of this chaos is a hive mind, and like your brain's doing that same thing. It's this electrical chaos that eventually comes into order, and that's how you have your thoughts. So it's like getting to this thing that we assume is like, oh, it's all peaceful because it's all one mind, but it's actually way more
Mm,
complicated than that. So
yeah.
it's fascinating. I don't know if anything that I just said makes sense, but, you know.
No, it does, and and you're right. It is fascinating because there's so much to explore with things like that. Um, how that would just how it would work. Like that's one of the big things I love answering is how does this work?
Mm.
Sometimes I just kind of take liberties with it. Like I don't really want to explain how the light speed travel works because well we don't have that, so I don't really want to go into that because I'm not a physicist. But
Just shrink space, and then you can go slower, but you're still going further. It's fine.
exactly. I
Not
actually
a big
learned
deal.
about that process after I had written it. I'm like, dang it. So I started kind of taking inspiration for some of the newer ships and all that stuff using like the prototypes that they had and like those computer animations and stuff, like with like the ring around it to kind of,
Mhm.
achieve that. And I'm like, oh, that's brilliant. I'm gonna do that now. But
Ali, what'd you have?
I was just curious. I was just curious. So each of your short stories, there's obviously like a time gap in between them, right?
yeah.
Because if it's like obviously you're not jumping from, one death into a baby or something, in the next one.
Correct.
So there's a bit of a time gap. So is your sequel, is it going to be the same kind of thing? Like, is there going to be like a time gap, or does it pretty much jump off right where the first one ends?
So the sequel is going to be a little bit different, but still similar in a way. The first one takes place over the course of a few hundred years, so there's a lot of ground to cover, and I only cover a few little just bits and pieces of this time period towards the latter half of what I call the Nebula Imperial Age in this timeline. Um, and we see this through a couple different people in different locations. Some are in the outer colonies, some are from Earth, some were born on ships in the middle of space. It just kind of depends. But we explore these different perspectives, and I tried to incorporate that into like the social climate at the time. At the end of the timeline, we start to see the downfall of this empire, how people are starting to trust it less. At the beginning, everyone is very much all for it, but then it starts to kind of fade towards the end. Um, and so, yeah, so in the first one, there's a lot of ground to cover, but I try to make the most of it by kind of having certain characters represent different populations um, yeah, of the empire. The second one, war, is going to take place over a much shorter period, only a few years. It takes place um, in one specific conflict. At the end of this, story, we're going to see some big event happen that kicks off some kind of conflict, and that's what the sequel is going to be about. Is going to be about the ensuing war between mankind and,
Hmm.
well, the other faction that I don't want to call out just yet, but
Okay.
um yeah, so that's going to be what that's about. And we're going to do something similar in the sense that we are going to have multiple characters that were actually kind of alluded to at the end of the first one, kind of set that up. And then, I'm already starting on the rough draft of the sequel. It kicks off a few hours later. Um, and,
Um,
and we're going to explore this conflict through different perspectives. There are going to be like different arcs and different stories within this. I don't know if I'm going to like jump back and forth or if I'm just going to do it one and done, like one long section about this person or about this person. It's probably going to be chopped up just like for the ease of the reader so that they're not like, wait, was this before this or that or whatever. I think I'll just do it one at a time, like one chapter at a time to make everything kind of work logically. But eventually the characters are going to get separated, and that's when we're going to get into the different arcs and the different perspectives. But they're going to start off together. in one location. Yeah.
That's
Okay.
really cool. And I like that it's like kind of jumping right off from the first one. I feel like most books, they usually the sequel or like the next book in a series takes place like, a few days or whatever after the first one, which I always find as a reader is really frustrating because the first thing that you do when a sequel comes out is you go and reread the first one. So, like the day before you get the second one in the mail, you go and you're reading those last couple pages, and there's all this like exciting things that are going on. And then you pick up the sequel and it's like, oh, a week later, and it's like back to kind of square one and there's no excitement, no tension or anything. And I recently read a book. It was a fantasy novel, and the second one picked up like 10 minutes after where the first one ended. So you're like thrown right into it. So I love that you're doing that because I think that's so exciting. I haven't really
Mhm.
experienced that before in a series or anything. And so I think that's so cool.
Yep.
Yeah. Like, and endings is is definitely like a very delicate process, right? Because if you do want to write a series, like this one is going to be, you want to leave room and setup for that sequel. You want to build up excitement by having that tension and that and that enthusiasm from the audience. But at the same time, I also don't want to make it a complete cliffhanger. This is a personal preference. I'm not saying this is like something that I find to be a necessity, but I don't like just pure cliffhangers because you know it just kind of, for some reason, for me, it just kind of leaves me like like feeling like groaning, like really like I
Mhm.
have to wait for the next one now.
Mhm.
Right.
Whereas if I have I like to find a nice balance between like, oh crap, like something's about to happen, but also we're closing, we're closing up another chapter of this, right?
Yep.
Like we've reached a good stopping point. Everything's
Mhm.
tied up in a neat little bow. We can move on to the next one, but it still connects somewhat seamlessly over.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I think that's a good application too. Like if, people out there don't want to write an anthology, like if you want to write a series, you should kind of like in the back of your mind treat it kind of similarly because like you want to have your contained story within your novel, but if you're writing a series, you want to have that meta narrative that's going across all of it that ties it together. And it's not just theme. It's like you want to have resolution in each book, otherwise the reader's going to be, really upset and may not want to spend the next 15-20 bucks to buy your next book. And so like
Mhm.
you can still leave them wanting by having a cliffhanger-ish thing with this meta narrative of something going on in the background where it's like, oh, I saw this whole thing happening in the first book. I didn't really know too much about what was going on. It didn't bother me because it wasn't the focus, but it leads me to want the second book as opposed to just be annoyed that I know there's going to be
Yeah,
a second book. So,
Mm.
yeah,
Yeah, and that's what epilogues are for too, really, to help.
yeah,
yeah.
Because
yeah.
I
all
utilize epilogues to
yeah.
the fullest
There you
extent.
go. There you go. Yeah. Yeah. Because I have 3 books out, and every single story is wrapped up. Well, like you said, a neat, tidy bow.
Hmm.
Everything, bad guys in the ground. But but it's still going, right? Like that. Yeah.
Hmm.
The overall theme or the huge arc is still moving. So we want to, use epilogues or I don't know, any other ways we can grab somebody else's, maybe a little hint towards the end that there's something else going on.
I mean, yeah, I think
Um, oh,
epilogues
sorry, go
and
ahead.
yeah, I was just gonna say epilogues and prologues are good, but something I really enjoyed reading just like some different people. So I know Brandon Sanderson does like interludes because his are so huge. But honestly, even in his shorter works, just having something where you're like, this seems like it might not be connected, but it's like maybe connecting everything that's going on to something bigger. So something I have been doing in my books is that every once in a while, when an important character dies, you'll then later get another perspective chapter from them as they go to hell. And like it's this whole thing, you're like, I don't know what's going on, what this is about, why it's important. But then I have a whole series that takes place in my underworld. And so it's like this idea of like already establishing which characters end up there and
Hmm.
who's going to be a part of that story. So it's like all of this things like, oh, I get to see, Steven and Frank and Susan all come together in this like heist kind of a movie in hell.
Hmm.
And so like I don't know. There's little things that you can do, and it doesn't have to be cookie cutter. You can do whatever you want. So,
Hmm. Yeah.
I'm kind of doing the opposite right now. I'm like working. I needed a way to like explain a war that happened in the past,
Hmm.
but it's actually relevant to my current story because it's an ongoing war. So it has the potential to move into the next novel, or like a prequel if I really wanted to. But I'm doing it through a series, like through a journal, and it's a journal that someone has found, and different entries from the journal explain like how they're feeling as they're living through this war. So it's really cool, I feel like, because you get like this completely different character's perspective, and it's not like you're explaining something. It's like you had mentioned earlier, Austin, it's someone's journal, and so it's a lot more personal. There's a lot more emotion in it. It feels a lot more urgent. And so it's just been really cool to be able to, I mean, it's not going forward, but it's kind of pulling a plot from the past into the present, which has been really cool.
That's good. All right.
Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say
I
that
was
just
gonna
makes me
say
think
that.
of. Yeah, go ahead.
Timothy's our guest. Go ahead.
Yeah, Timothy, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that I agree, and that perspective is something that I definitely like to play with a lot. That was all I was gonna say.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say that what you're talking about, Holly, reminds me too that like people also use that kind of stuff in like epigraphs, I think is what it's called, like at the beginning of the chapter, where it's like, oh, here's a fragment of a letter pieced out throughout the entire story. So like it doesn't have to be a separate work or something like that. It can just be like strewn throughout your entire story. So
Yeah, I read the adult fantasy, I think it's considered an adult fantasy novel, that just came out. And that's what they do, is at the beginning of each chapter, there's like this section from like either a codex or someone's journal on training or like something. And there's like this little like 3-line blurb. And you don't really think that it's relevant. It just seems like it's kind of nonsense information. But by the end of the novel, if you go back and reread all of those, you're like, oh my gosh, how did I not see this coming? Like it's right there,
It's
right?
right there, yeah.
Yeah. So it's really, I love that, because you're kind of like sprinkling little treats along, but people don't really get it until the end, and then it all comes together, right? It's like an extra surprise.
Yeah.
Nice. All right. Well, now it's time for the fun part of our show. We talk about don'ts for us, because we're still learning. Even though I have a few books out, Austin, you're on Vela, right? And always writing. Holly is going to have a blockbuster next year.
Yeah, right.
Blockbuster. And obviously our an awesome guest, Timothy's got an anthology. But anyway, we're all beginning, but we like to talk about don'ts. As far as short stories go, don't do this. So I guess I'll start. Nobody's raising their hands, jumping up. So I would say, so I looked to see what the word count length was for all the stuff in general, 10,000. And then novella is generally 40,000. But as I shared earlier in the beginning, I discovered that I am done with my novella, and it's not 40,000. It's going to be more like 30 to 32,000. So I would say don't, just let that be like a general kind of it's there, but hey, guess what? You can write a 15,000 word short story, or a 2,000 word short story. So don't think that just because there's a rule, in that, like you have to stick to it. You don't. It's just as a guideline, as a general kind of a principle, but definitely don't stay glued to the stuff like that. That's what I got.
On a similar note, because I agree with that 100%, is that I would say a don't is, like what you were saying, don't get caught up on, on word count goals. When the story is done, it's done, let it grow naturally. If you force it, to be stretched out, you get something that, has a bunch of unnecessary pieces. And when I say unnecessary, I mean like actually unnecessary. And instead of, like, oh, like this contributes to like another like hidden thing. And if you try to crunch it too small, the pacing can also get messed up. It can seem too quick. It can leave, unanswered questions that you might overlook. So yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like word count, like we have all these, these thoughts about, like, oh, I need to have it be at least this if I want it to be taken seriously. Like when I was writing my book, I was like, oh my gosh, if it's not good, if it's not long enough, it might not be taken seriously. And that's something, and it's my first book, I don't want people to think it's a joke. Um, but, I had to learn to kind of get past that and understand that, it's a story. It's done when it's done. It's in a way, it's kind of like its own entity. Um, and you have to let it just grow the way it wants to. You can't force it, otherwise you can get, you know, less than desirable results.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I'll say building off of that too, don't stress the fillers, right? Like I was talking about myself earlier, how I was working on filling those pages in between the intro and, the exciting part. Especially with a short story, don't worry about trying to, jam those little details in there, because that's just, again, going to add to that word count. And a lot of it's probably going to be unnecessary. Um, I feel like, especially for good writers, like your first instinct is to write the things that are really important. And so don't spend all that time worrying about things that you think that, oh yeah, like what if people want to read this, or what if people might want to know this? Just go with your instincts and don't stress about putting those extra little things in there, because you can always add them later. And a lot of the times, I'm sure with, that short amount of words, you're probably not going to need them.
Hmm. Good points.
Coming from someone who doesn't write short stories.
It's perfect.
Yeah. But I think on like a similar note, like don't over explain things. Like you don't have to get down into it. Like, if I say like, the dude's a space wizard, don't need to get into the details. You get what I mean. Move on. Like, yeah, obviously I'm not talking about like that, but like your reader is going to understand a lot more than you're going to give them credit for. Or, if you dumb it down, they're going to get really bored, especially in a short story. Like they're not there for, getting into the weeds. They're there for the fast action. It's like a thrill to just get through it. So don't overcomplicate it. You're writing, 20, 30 pages, not 400, 500 like I like to. So yeah, just don't overcomplicate it. Your short story is not a series. It's not a, trilogy of novels. So keep it
Yes.
simple.
Yeah.
Yes.
I agree with that. I think one of the funniest things that I catch a lot, and it amazes me how often I see this happen, is they're like, and he walked across the room, and I'm like, oh, that's how we got there. Like totally
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
like I would have assumed he had walked over there. He
Yeah.
probably didn't float there. He probably didn't fly there.
Yeah. It's
Unnecessary.
materialized.
Yeah, they talk about cutting out the shoe leather. Like, I don't need to see how they wore down their shoe. Like, just get from, they left the supermarket, they're home. Unless
Yeah.
something cool happens on the way home,
Mhm.
do not talk about it. Just have them walk in their front door. It's fine. I can understand what happened in between. But yeah, like, I did say, like, don't turn your short story into a novel. But also, if you do, I mean, this is kind of a don't/do. You have to change it a little bit because like we said, like your short story is going to have like maybe one main plot, like one story structure. It's going to be really simple, but if you expand it, you got to expand the whole thing. Don't just assume this is good enough. People love the short story. It can serve as a whole novel. And I hate to say it, but I'm looking at Ender's Game. It was a fantastic short story,
Yes.
but I could not stand it as a novel. But, maybe that's my hot take of the day. So,
Wow. All right. Yeah, Orson Scott Card. You listening, buddy? Anyways.
he actually spoke at my school once. So,
Okay. All right. Well, before we go, Timothy, how can we find your work again?
So right now my book is exclusive to barnesandnoble.com. You know, you can search it by title or author. Title might be a little bit better since my name is, not the most not the most elusive out there, but it is Vessels of Core Conquest. Core is spelled just C-O-R, then there's a colon in Conquest. My Instagram page where I kind of post, like updates and things of that nature is going to be author _ McBride, McBride. And lastly, my website where you can find like, free short stories and the occasional update on like bigger projects, especially those pertaining to this series and this book. You can find that on www.vesselsofcore.webador.com.
Webador is spelled how? Just in case.
Webador. It's
Okay.
yeah.
I'm glad I asked because I was going to use an I where the A is. Webador, but that makes
Yeah.
more sense. Yeah. Okay. Well, great, Timothy. That was fantastic. You're fascinating.
Yeah,
Like
thanks for joining us.
that's
Thank
an
you so much for
easy.
being
Of
here.
course, guys. Thank you so much for having me. I feel honored.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. Wow, that was very nice of you. But we'd love to have you on again. Love to have you on again.
Of course.
Probably when you're ready to launch your next one, we'd love to have you back. Sound good?
Absolutely, yeah.
Sweet. Okay.
When all the pressure's off.
Okay. Real quick before we go, when do you think that would be ready, your sequel?
Honestly, it's tough to gauge. I wish I could say it'll be ready by a certain time. The truth is, I don't want to rush anything. So I just kind of want to make sure that I get everything right and that I don't drop the ball by just
Right.
by the sheer weight of my expectations. So
It's
I
very
just want to
mature.
so honestly, we're still kind of in the early phases. I don't know when it's going to be. Like I said, the best way to figure to keep in touch is to be following that Instagram and checking on the website because I will be definitely making it known in
Okay.
those places.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Boom,
Excellent.
that is the correct answer.
Yeah, I was gonna say I love that you say that because I feel like so many times when people check in like, oh, like how's your book coming? Like, and like, oh yeah, good. Like, I'm on chapter 27 and they're like, out of how many? I'm like, I don't know, probably like 60 something. And they're like, you're not like even close to being done yet. And I'm like, these things don't just happen like
Yeah.
overnight, like it's a process.
Right. Well, thank you so much,
You take
Timothy, for
time.
joining us. Yeah.
Of
Yeah,
course,
thank
guys.
you. I
Thank you
really
so
appreciate
much.
it.
Of course. Have
Let's
a good
see.
night, guys.
Yeah. Don't forget to write and subscribe to our channels and the links below or via your favorite podcast service so you don't miss any of the Writers Realm content. We always love to hear from our listeners. So if you have a question or a topic you want us to dive into, please get in touch with us or with Timothy J McBride. Until then, have a good night. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye, y'all.